Tim Summers, welcome to BRI Dialogues. I have to tell you, your last name brings warmth not only to our program, but also to the cold temperatures in London. For some of our audience who are not familiar with your stellar background, I just want to highlight bits and pieces of it. You're assistant professor at the Center for China Studies, China University, Hong Kong. You're a gifted author with 3 books, Hong Kong, The Politics of a Global City, China's Regions in the Era of Globalization, Yunnan, a Chinese Bridge to Asia, fellow at the Chatham House for a decade, and various papers and publications, including EU-China innovation relations, which is at the heart of everything that is happening with e-mobility. So we want to unpeel and peel that as well with you. And you're also a member of the Global China Research and the Policy Research Program at the China University, Hong Kong, a former diplomat turned academic, and of course, fluent in both Cantonese and Putonghua. So we couldn't be more excited than having somebody with all of these capabilities and expertise on the program. And I want to kick off with this question, Tim. It's 30 years since the handover of Hong Kong. 7 prime ministers late in UK. What is the role of Hong Kong in China's ambitions globally, and particularly in relations to the Belt Road Initiative? Where is the city-state sitting? Bring us to what's happening on the ground.
Yeah, well, thanks, Ali and Anush, for the very warm welcome. And it's great to be with you to talk about all sorts of things to do with Hong Kong, to do with China, more widely to do with the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think, Hong Kong's role in some ways has been a consistent role over many decades. It's a place through which China connects to other parts of the world, and connects in ways that are different from other cities in China. And in Hong Kong, you can do things which you can't do elsewhere. And this, I think, particularly applies in the economic and the financial and the business worlds. Hong Kong has this sort of capitalist system. It has a freely convertible currency, an open capital account. It has a common law system. It has headquarters or regional headquarters for banks, financial institutions, businesses from all over the world. And those features of Hong Kong, enable it to, and have enabled it to play a role in connecting China and China's economy with other parts of the world. So in that sense, there's a consistency of the story over many decades. But of course, there are also things that have changed, and at different points in Hong Kong's history, the nature of China's relationship with the outside world has been different, and therefore the role of Hong Kong has been different. And so, for example, we go back to the 1950s when we had this sort of Cold War between the United States and China in particular, and Hong Kong's role was shaped by that geopolitical environment. And then fast forward to the 1980s, reform and opening up in China, China's integration into the global economy. Hong Kong then plays a different role. Hong Kong manufacturing industries start shifting north into Shenzhen and parts of southern China. Fast forward again another couple of decades, you have China's entry to the World Trade Organization. You have Chinese companies starting to go global, looking to list on stock markets overseas, and Hong Kong has always been a popular choice for that. So the nature of that role has changed. And I think what we've had since, let's say, the late 1970s, since the US-China rapprochement, and until relatively recently, the late 2010s, maybe 2019, 2020, is that role took place in the context of a broadly benign relationship between China and the West. In particular, the United States is important there. And in the context for most of that period of an economy which was globalizing, and globalization was not a dirty word until maybe 2016 or thereabouts. And then things start to change. Right. So the politics shifts, as we know, 2016, 2017 key points in the US's policy towards China changing. And the general view in much of the world, much of the West in particular, about globalization starts to change. And people talk about deglobalization and de-risking and all these sorts of things. So this, I think, has meant that Hong Kong's role, it's the sweet spot that it enjoyed for a long time, is not something that's so easy for it to fulfill right in the present moment. And some people say, well, this means Hong Kong is over. There was a piece in the Financial Times by Stephen Roach recently, right, with that headline. Perhaps the headline is a little bit of an exaggeration of the thesis that he put forward. But I think one of the things that Hong Kong can do and is looking to do is to respond to the way that China's relations with the outside world are shifting and changing. So China-US relations may be not good, but the world is not the same as it was, a decade ago. We've got a diffusion of power, of economic influence. The US is still very powerful in a country, and we might come on to talk about that later, talking about structural power and things. But there's a change, right, in where the dynamism in the world is, whether it's Southeast Asia or the Middle East or parts of Africa. And I think Hong Kong then, its role is still one connecting China with the world, but the world for Hong Kong is going to look slightly different from the West, which dominated that set of external relationships for many decades. So we're at this sort of point of flux and change, and to be honest, we have to see how this pans out, how easy these changes are to make, and what the broader relationships between China and other parts of the world allow Hong Kong to do.
Absolutely fantastic opener for us, Tim. So it's nearly 10 years since the last time I co-hosted you at an event that was in cooperation with University of Nottingham's China Institute. And we sat in that fabulous building pondering what was still being referred to as One Belt, One Road initiative before BRI became its kind of, its brand. And we were very unsure of things. President Xi was only just beginning to flex his political muscles at home, let alone internationally. And we had a very sanguine view of China, of its foreign policy, and also the location of Hong Kong involved. As you rightly say, much changed before we met nearly a decade ago, and much has changed perhaps even faster since 2014-15 when we were in Nottingham. So the question for us in 2024, for me at least, is given that Hong Kong is now much less of an autonomous region, that it's one country, two systems, appears to kind of be fading at the edges, at the political level at least. And given perhaps, China's growing economic headaches at home, is it still valid to argue or to posit that China serves as the window onto globalization and the West for mainland China? Or given that now Hong Kong is much more integrated with the mainland, and given that that Beijing doesn't want Hong Kong to be this kind of, this freelance economic unit, how is Hong Kong's identity and positioning changing in relation to the mainland, but what function will it continue to serve going forward, Tim?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to unpack in that question, Anush. And perhaps distinction between politics and economics is one way of starting to unpack some of that in answering your points. Hong Kong's politics has clearly changed since 2019, 2020. We had a year of considerable unrest, followed by COVID, but also followed by the national security law and some changes in political structure and so on. So we now have a more executive-led government approach in Hong Kong. The government was very weak before this. We don't have the same sort of public dissent, public protests that we did before 2020. The politics has clearly changed, and I think you're right to say that Beijing doesn't want Hong Kong to be a sort of political entrepreneur in that sense of going off and doing things politically which, from the central government's perspective, are inconsistent with national goals and national priorities, right? So I think that politics has changed. But when it comes to the economy and to finance, I'm not sure things have changed so dramatically and so radically. Actually, to be honest, I think we still have the same institutional structures in place in Hong Kong in terms of the legal system, the judicial system, the financial markets, and so on. So from an institutional perspective, I'm not sure things have changed that much. What has changed is the relationship with the West. And in response to 2019, the US, along with other US allies, the UK, some of the Europeans, Australia, took an approach to Hong Kong, which is basically it's strongly opposed to Beijing's reforms and changes that Beijing has made, and we see that just at the very moment in the last few days with discussions about the latest round of national security legislation in Hong Kong. So that has changed. Now, when it comes to the US, that has actually had practical consequences in terms of sanctions, in terms of limitations on what people can do as investors, as US investors, and so on. So there is a constraint on that role that Hong Kong can play in connecting the US and China that wasn't there before, right? And I think, probably to go into too much detail of the financial areas is a little bit perhaps outside our time and possibly outside my expertise as well. But I think that the broader institutional framework that Hong Kong has, enables it to play a role in connecting with other parts of the world, right? There's been a lot of talk in Hong Kong about Saudi Arabia in particular, and other Middle Eastern businesses and financial connections. And other cities in China don't have this. Right. So this I think still is Hong Kong's comparative advantage. And comparative advantage is an important concept, which is one that crops up in the policy documents like relating to the Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau, Greater Bay Area that's been discussed over the last 5 years or so, a little bit longer than 5 years. But of course, China has changed a lot too. So the other part of the answer to your question is there are the big, fast-growing, rapidly developed, sophisticated cities and companies elsewhere in China that are able to offer an awful lot that Hong Kong is not able to offer. Whether it's your Huawei's and telecommunications, or your electric vehicles companies, your platform companies like Tencent or Alibaba. I mean, these are major innovative companies that Hong Kong for them is a small place, right? And they will do their own thing, and they are doing their own thing and engaging economically with other parts of the world. So in that sense, Hong Kong's role is, it's not quite as vital as it might have appeared in the past to China's engagement with the rest of the world.
That is absolutely fascinating, Tim, because those are the perspectives that we simply don't get sitting this side of the world, about those dynamics as you so fully explained. A left field question, because I know Ali's poised to come in, and so here in the UK, there is much talk about the Hong Kongers moving to London, to Britain en masse. I don't know, the figures are into 100,000, 200,000 plus sometimes. I don't know whether you have or Ali has. I've never seen any accurate figures of this, but nevertheless, there is a trend in this direction. Does that matter to anybody?
Well, I think it does. So I think that the latest figure that I saw from the British government was, I think, 191,000. So it's around 200,000, as you say. I guess some of those people may move and then come back, or they may travel backwards and forwards, right? I think it does matter. I mean, obviously it matters to a segment of Hong Kong's population, right? There are people for whom this British National Overseas Passport scheme that the British government introduced in 2020, basically opening up a pathway to citizenship for potentially up to over 5 million people from Hong Kong, actually, if all family members are included. For many in Hong Kong, that's been seen as a great opportunity, whether they're uneasy about Hong Kong politics or whether they would like to have a different place to live with more space or different education system for their children, all sorts of things, right? So I think on the personal level, for many of these individuals, it matters, and it's had an impact. I think for the broader long-term sort of positioning of Hong Kong, it's probably not so significant. In the short term, I think there's been a bit of an impact, perhaps in some particular sectors, where if you've had a lot of people moving rapidly, rapid change is always challenging to deal with. So I think there've been some short-term challenges in various places. But in the long run, Hong Kong's population is 7.3 million or something. Now, the trend has been upwards. People are coming certainly from mainland China, but also from other parts of the world, increasingly international, community, and providing different sets of skills and so on. So I think in the longer run, Hong Kong will do fine, right? There's plenty of demand for people to who want to come and live and work here, but there's perhaps this sort of short-term period of adaptation that's needed as a result of some of this movement. We should also remember that a number of other people have moved to Canada and Australia, I think possibly the US as well. There are a few other Western countries that have got similar schemes, but I think the numbers there are a little bit lower than the numbers moving to the United Kingdom.
Tim, while the two of you were talking about it, having been both a tenant and a landlord in the various courses of my life, I just felt like it's like the landlord coming and seeing that part of the assets in the house that was rented are gone and taken away. So the VNO's movement, as you know, it was a little bit of a heist in the eyes of the mainland China in that context. But I wanted to ask you a question. With Trump, almost everybody preparing themselves, and Keir Starmer, almost everybody preparing themselves, what would the UK-US relation in that context look like? And how will they posture towards a one country, three systems with Taiwan as well in 10 years' time? It goes by so quickly. Or it's going to be one country, two systems? And where does that put that soft partisanship that you so eloquently in some of your papers have addressed? And where does UK stand in this whole dance?
Yeah, well, I think, I'm not an expert on US politics, but it seems to me that when it comes to the broad approach to China, there is not substantial difference between the two parties and between the different candidates. There are some exceptions, perhaps things like climate change, which Biden has made a central part of engaging with China, and I think that's welcome for those who take that issue seriously. But beyond that, I think Biden has broadly continued what Trump did in the first term. He's worked more closely with allies, with places like the UK. Those relationships have been better, at least from the Americans' perspective, than they were under Trump. But I don't expect any radical change in US policy towards China if Trump is re-elected or whoever is elected at the end of the year. And I suppose there's a difficult and complicated question about what's driving these changes in US policy, and there are lots of things there, but I think one of the most fundamental drivers, this is a sort of realist international relations perspective, is the shift in power distribution. That China has just become more powerful, and people across the political spectrum in the United States talk about China as a peer competitor or a pacing challenge, or whatever phrase people like to use, and that's not really going to change. China is going to continue to develop, to grow its economy at least as fast as the US. So I think for the UK and for others, that's the context within which they'll have to make policy. And my impression of British foreign policy generally since Brexit, particularly since the integrated review was published in 2021, is that it's been tied more closely to the United States over recent years. The European Union is obviously no longer a sort of an institution where the UK can shape policy, and which in turn shapes British foreign policy in an institutionalized manner. The UK has its tilt to the Indo-Pacific. It has various other slogans that the government has been putting forward, but all of those are very much consistent with US strategic goals. And I think whether it's, whatever issue we look at around the world, including crises in the Middle East and in Ukraine, we see the UK basically following the US line. And I expect that's what, whether Keir Starmer or someone else, whoever is Prime Minister, I think they will basically be doing the same thing over the coming years. And that can be quite challenging because I don't fundamentally think that the UK and Europeans generally have quite the same set of interests when it comes to China as the United States does. US, whether you like it or not, can justifiably argue that China is a basic challenge to US dominance in global affairs, right? But for the UK, for others, I think China offers a rather different and more complicated set of opportunities as well as some challenges. So, there's perhaps an argument that a more independent foreign policy when it comes to China could serve British interests better. But I expect that the UK will be tied to Washington for some time to come.
Tim, you're covering so much ground so eloquently that I'm trying to kind of keep up and catch up with you. I was interested in response to Ali. You said that you don't see much changing in US-China bilateral relations, but let me broaden that a little bit and look at, say, a Trump victory, US foreign policy. That then goes beyond US-China relations and then we explore how Trump's foreign policy towards Taiwan, Europe, Ukraine, Britain, globalization, onshoring, IRA Act, the whole gamut of stuff that's been going on that he's already said he wants to undo or revisit and so on. So what happens when Trump changes everything else in the world to China-US relations?
Yeah, great question, Anush. And I mean, I think, I'm not quite sure how to start to answer that because there's so much possible change sort of included within the framework there. Well, I mean, first of all, China has to work out how to respond to those changes, how to try to deal with a Trump United States again. And I think, but again, I mean, maybe I'm being too conservative and not imaginative enough in my answers. But again, I feel China will probably take a broadly similar sort of approach to the one that it's taken over recent years, which is to try to de-escalate a little bit, to try to look for opportunities for dialogue, for working together. But, the challenge for Chinese foreign policy is not to do that in a way that sacrifices what Beijing sees as fundamental interests or that presents a picture of China as being too compliant. I think that's something that the Chinese leadership and parts of the Chinese public are not wanting to do. But I feel that the Chinese leadership has made an effort to try to build bridges and to respond positively to the US where it can, whether it's Trump or Biden. Right? I mean, I think one of the Trump examples is the so-called phase one trade deal, which I think was probably early 2020. It was sort of towards the end of Trump's presidency. And I mean, largely seemed to me to consist of concessions made by China to Washington. And of course, there are people who will debate, well, the implementation wasn't there and so on. There's I think, sort of challenge to follow that up. And then Trump left office and whatnot. But I think that, you know, that to me sort of does indicate that Beijing is prepared to try to be flexible. Again, from a realist perspective, you can say, well, that reflects the fact that maybe Beijing doesn't have the confidence in its capabilities, or it doesn't have the capabilities to do anything else at the moment. So this is, you know, one fundamental question is, how powerful really is the United States still? We've seen this diffusion of power. We're seeing this changing world. I definitely think we are. But at the same time, the US remains the single strongest country on the planet by some way. If we aggregate that across all of the different areas, finance, economy, innovation, science and technology, military power, even soft power, although its soft power has taken quite a hit over the last few years in certain areas. But, you know, don't think any country can yet match that. China can't yet match that across the board. Now, China may be beginning to be able to match that a little bit in parts of Asia, but in other parts of Asia, as we've seen, there's strong reactions against China, and inconsistent ones, places like the Philippines, depending on who the president, who the government is. So, you know, China's space for being, you know, for doing something too kind of provocative vis-a-vis the United States, I think is somewhat limited, even if that was in the style of Chinese diplomacy.
Right. Sorry, Ali. But you know, Ali and I hear a lot from EU capitals and Brussels about, look what's happening in America. Look what Trump is saying. Look what he's saying about NATO. We need to develop our own kind of more autonomous security, diplomatic, political machine in Europe, that we cannot bank on them. So if I was sitting in Beijing, you know, I would say, well, that's music to our ears. We've wanted Europeans to be an independent pillar of international system. And thanks to Trump, they're waking up to this. So all we got to do is hope for a Trump victory, and then, you know, Europe will be a low-hanging fruit. But I don't think it's that simple, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I agree with the premises of your question, Anush. Actually, a few years ago, I was part of a European think tank network on China report on strategic autonomy and sort of Europe in US-China relations, and that theme is definitely there in European policy making towards China and towards other issues. And of course, Europe then has got pulled back in the other direction when it comes to China policy over recent years, not just under Biden, but I think under Trump too. You know, Europe's complicated. There are differences within countries and between countries on how they'd like to position themselves, and probably those debates will get more intense, I suspect, if Trump is elected. But I don't think it's just about Trump. I think it's also, you know, the US more generally, right? I think US interests and US approaches have toughened and hardened, and that's not broadly in Europe's economic interests. Certainly, that will be my take on that. But have we seen an ability to develop that strategic autonomy? Not very strongly, I think. I mean, certainly not in the UK, right? Over the last 5 years, where the opposite has happened. You could say there was a moment in 2015 when it looked like the UK might be developing some autonomy from Washington on policy towards China. We had the decision to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in the spring of 2015. We had Xi Jinping's visit in October of that year. We had things like the UK taking a different approach towards Huawei and 5G from the United States in spite of US objections. There were a number of indicators of a rather autonomous approach to China 9 or 10 years ago, but those have all disappeared. The Huawei decision has been reversed, largely under US pressure, not entirely, but largely. You know, the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, well, the UK is still a member, but it's rather lower profile. It doesn't really seem to feature in British government ministers' speeches about the Indo-Pacific or about Asia policy. And you know, the UK has very much followed Washington in a more hawkish direction on China. I mean, even the latest iterations of policy that have an element of engagement with China, well, that's also there in the US's policy. That's not something that's autonomous from Washington. That's just a balancing that the US itself, I think, has realized it needs to include, right, to draw some sort of line under the free fall of US-China relations over recent years. So I'm not sure, Anush, actually, if I answered your question there, but those are some reflections
Tim, I want to take you back to what you and Anush were discussing on soft power. With everything that has happened from Iraq to Afghanistan, the way US left, the Ukraine and Russia war, and the tragedies in Middle East that are turning into their 5th month, almost half a year. The world, in my view, is malnourished and has a hunger for soft power and has a gastroparesis for hard power. And the global South is looking, forget the 1.4 billion people in Western Five Eyes and continental Europe and United States. The rest of the world is saying, enough of this, let's develop, let's progress. Is there a silver lining for China to capitalize on its GDI, Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and with an isolationist possibility from United States under Trump? Couldn't that be a wind in the sail of China for banking on it?
Yes, I think it could, and I think you've outlined the reasons for that very clearly in your question, Ali. And I think that's actually what Chinese diplomacy is seeking to achieve as much as possible at the moment, to try to sort of draw some line under the problems in relations with the US and other parts of the West, but then to focus as much diplomatic effort as possible, political and economic, on the global South, on other parts of the world, and that will have some effect, because the underlying reality is that China has become more powerful, it's become more influential, it's got a sophisticated economy, it's a source of investment, right? To go back to the BRI, which we haven't really touched on in any detail, but the BRI is a sort of symbol for China's spreading economic engagement globally, particularly with the global South. I think definitely there's a lot of potential there, and that can bring some very positive change and development to many parts of the world with which China is trying to engage. So yes, I mean, soft power is the power of attraction, as technically perhaps. That picture may be more complicated. There's some reading some recent research in the Pacific Review on this. There's some quite complicated pictures about how different publics and elites respond across the global South. It's not a simple monolithic part of the world where everyone is responding in the same way. But I agree with you that there's plenty of potential for Chinese diplomacy there.
Talking of diplomacy, Tim, is another area that we know you have a particular interest in, and we hear not enough of it in this part of the world, at least. In the US, definitely they do a lot more than we do here, is the prospects for unification and or Taiwan-Chinese tensions. All we hear is when there are kind of blips in Chinese military aircraft, kind of straying, or Chinese naval vessels straying. There is a geostrategic dimension to this, and that is that Taiwan actually sits on where it sits is it controls China's maritime navigation access, because the seas are so shallow. And so Taiwan provides this kind of geographical barrier. So at one level, it is an existential issue when you sit in Beijing. But put that aside, there is the political, economic dimensions of this, where US might be. But given this kind of decoupling that you mentioned in response to Ali's question, deglobalization, the pressures on Taiwan not to supply China with high-tech semi manufacturing inputs and so on. Do you think Taiwan is in a happy place given the relations between US and China? And if it isn't, what choices does the government in Taipei actually face?
Yeah, I mean, I think Taiwan is in a difficult place between the US and China, and that has probably become it's probably become more difficult over recent years. But certainly, what we can say, there's been a lot more attention paid to it over recent years, right? So attention has shifted from places like Hong Kong, to go back to our start of our discussion, to Taiwan, and I think a lot of that seems to me is driven from the US as much as from mainland China or Taiwan themselves. And my sense is that US sort of strategic thinking or policy thinking has increasingly begun to treat Taiwan as it's that old metaphor of the unsinkable aircraft carrier. I think it's the sort of for reasons that you outline, right? Geostrategic value to the United States, and therefore worth protecting. I mean, this is a complicated policy area, and there are people who study the wording of everything that has been said in more detail than I do. But Biden has talked about, or has made comments about, defending Taiwan, which is a departure from traditional strategic ambiguity, and then some of his officials have had to row those back. I mean, I think there's been some lack of clarity, some oscillations in US policy language over the last few years, and my sense is that it's shifting. It's also clearly shifting in the sense of trying to develop deeper ties with Taiwan directly. And from Beijing's perspective, some of that is going outside what was agreed in the communiques in 1972, 79, and 82, when the US and the PRC established their diplomatic ties. Now, again, that's an area that others are engaged in. The UK is engaged in some other European countries, but the US is the key. The US and Japan probably are the key drivers there. So it's not a there's a lot more attention paid to Taiwan, certainly. Not sure that Taiwan has a lot of very easy strategic choices that it can make. I mean, the basic choices that people tend to lay out are independence, status quo, unification or reunification, right, depending on your persuasion. And the majority of opinion in Taiwan still seems to favor the status quo. Falling, independence would be an escalatory option. Unification or reunification is not popular in Taiwan. Were Beijing to attempt that in some way, that would definitely provoke a response from the US. We don't know exactly what sort of response that would be. So I think Taiwan's own interests are best served by some sort of status quo choice. The problem is that the world doesn't stay the same, and status quo is shifting. Taiwan public opinion is shifting, the politics is changing, the US is changing its strategic approach to Taiwan, I think, from my perspective. And then possibly Beijing is considering alternatives as well. There was recently a work conference on Taiwan, and some people have gone through the output of that work conference in some detail, sort of looking for shifts in policy from Beijing and the way that people have been doing for a number of years. So, the speculation is whether that might lead to some more proactive move to try to take back control over Taiwan at some point in the future. I don't think that's going to happen soon, right? And soon is at least a number of years. The talk of 2027 or even 2030, I think, is, in my instinctive view, really very unlikely to see Xi Jinping, Beijing do something within that time frame. I think think the Chinese leadership is much more cautious, much more risk averse than that. But when we get into the 2030s, 2040s, who knows?
But Tim, when you look at it, a great part of BRI's trajectory is on construction of infrastructure, currency, the de-dollarization, and connectivity, which is the technology, and TSMC stands there in a very prominent role. I had the privilege of being with Anush the past 2 days in beautiful Durham, and one of the things that I shared was that in 2011, Elon Musk, in a Bloomberg interview, said, BYD, who wants to ride their cars? I mean, look at those cars. Fast forward, the e-mobility and electronic vehicles are fantastically, giving a run for the money to the European and American manufacturers. If China doubles down on building the capacity, then the choice for Taiwan becomes a real estate discussion rather than technology. So in 10 years' time, if China has as good as an EV that it has in manufacturing, foundries and chip manufacturing, then with a Trump that is as well focused for the next 4 years on trade, for that matter, more than, a war president, then China has had it both ways, doesn't it? And doesn't that lead as well, if China masters that art, for the BRI as well, for connectivity, of saying, I don't have a pressure, I can, pounce on Taiwan anytime I want. As a matter of fact, I have better semiconductors now.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds, from a Chinese perspective, a reasonably good, scenario. And perhaps there are, good reasons to suppose that it will happen. I mean, we've seen, as you've given the example of BYD and electric vehicles, right? We've seen in other areas, even since the US's controls on semiconductor sales to Chinese companies and so on, we've seen some quite significant breakthroughs in China. Again, these are quite technical things that I think are difficult for lay people like myself to evaluate. But I mean, the broad direction is one of Chinese companies becoming more capable, more sophisticated. The innovation is definitely growing. Now, whether they can move to the tech frontier and take over, right, in the forefront of global developments in sectors, or whether they will just be, a little bit behind, a couple of nanometers behind at various points in time. Perhaps it doesn't matter that much for the Chinese economy if it's still growing more sophisticated and able, therefore, to be more influential globally. So, I mean, I'm sure that does have an impact on Taiwan, right? There's I think, an argument and a thought from Beijing that economics might eventually enable them to deliver what they want in relation to Taiwan. I think the problem the fundamental problem that Beijing has is, firstly, the geopolitics of the US position on Taiwan, and then secondly, the public sentiment in Taiwan itself, which is a long way off wanting to reunify with the mainland in any form, and it's going to take quite a lot to turn that around. I think so. Those fairly fundamental challenges, and as we've seen from other areas in the world over recent years, sometimes economic logic and economic arguments don't go very far when you're talking politics with populations. People make decisions for all sorts of reasons that maybe not in their best economic interests.
Right. Tim, but also, Chinese leadership looks at other wars that were meant to be quick, but have never yielded the results. That's why our generals are always so cautious about starting a war, because they know that it never ends as the political figures assume it would. So I suspect there must be a huge degree of that, which is animating thinking in Beijing, that Taiwan is full of thorns. It's not that easy to swallow militarily. But beyond that, though, isn't there, going back to discussion of soft power, isn't there also the danger of China shooting itself in the foot, literally, in that regard as well? That while it it berates United States for its aggressive behavior elsewhere, for not supporting peaceful settlements of disputes in the world. On the one hand, on the other hand, itself talking about a global security initiative, a global development initiative, a global civilization initiative, and so on, and then moves its troops to this little island of its mainland. What kind of an image is that going to leave with the rest of the world? That you know what, all of that in the end was realpolitik and nothing to do with a we are a do-gooder narrative sort of thing.
Yeah, there's definitely some contradictions, right? And when it comes to perceptions, I mean, soft power is going to be developed or not based on other people's perceptions of you, and those perceptions are always difficult to control and to influence. And there are clearly plenty of negative perceptions about China in its neighborhood as well as further afield. And probably, whenever China does military exercises around Taiwan or something, there's a chance that you lose a few points, right, in the global in the global soft power perceptions index, as it were. But I think also on your first comment, Anush, I agree with you that wars are difficult to win, and I think that the Chinese leadership is, my perception is, they're very cautious, very risk averse. They wouldn't do something unless they really felt confident of victory. And then the more you look around the world, the more you realize that's very difficult to guarantee in advance. And I think that it's one reason why I think we're not very likely to see any significant conflict in the waters off China's coastline. I mean, we'll see some incidents with fishermen and coast guards and things that we see from time to time, but I think the Chinese will be very, very careful not to escalate things, whether it's in the South China Sea or in the Taiwan Straits. So it's a very delicate balancing act. It's a difficult one, and yeah, if it was just about soft power, you might behave differently, but it's not just about soft power, right? China has other interests and other goals that it's trying to achieve, as every country does, and you can't win all of the things all the time.
Well, Tim, normally we bring our episodes, conversations, BRI dialogues to an end with a standard question for all of our guests. And who better than you, having been a diplomat and now an academic and a professor and teaching? What is your single most important piece of advice to the cinephobes and to the cinephiles? What would you leave them with in light of everything we discussed today?
Well, I think whatever your perspective is, I think the best thing to do is to try to read and listen to as many different diverse perspectives as possible, and always try to engage with the arguments of people you disagree with or who disagree with you. And I think we all need a certain amount of intellectual modesty, that these are hugely complicated questions. I mean, you've put me on the spot, right, a number of times over the last 45 minutes, and there's a lot of really difficult things going on here, and there's a lot of things that are inevitably going to be outside our areas of expertise. And I think we need to acknowledge the limitations of what we know, and we try to build our knowledge and to develop a better understanding. But to do that in an open and rational and constructive way, whatever side of the political spectrums you sit on.
Brilliant, Tim. I'm very jealous of the community that you're sitting amongst, your students, your peers, and all the other groups that you interact with, because they have the privilege of hearing you and listening to you and talking to you on a regular basis. And I'm very cross at the same time that it's taken 10 years for me to have the privilege of hear you speak and to enjoy the insights that you bring to any party. So it's been an absolute privilege to reconnect with you. And thank you for accepting our invitation to come on BR Dialogues, and also for you to shed so much light on so many gray areas that had baffled us, by us. I don't mean just Aliena, but I mean the whole gamut of decision makers, whether in finance, whether it is investment, whether it is politics, and so on. So it's been an absolute honor to have you with us, Tim. I hope that life continues peacefully and at ease in Hong Kong. We would always love to see you back in the UK. And when you are, I know Ali would like to have you in London, but I would personally come and drive you all the way up to Durham, if you permit. So it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much, Tim, indeed.
Thank you for being.
Well, that would be wonderful, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's been my honor to talk to you and to appear on BRA Dialogues. I've really enjoyed the discussion, and I've enjoyed watching some of the other episodes that you've put up on YouTube. So it's great to be here, and I hope we have more fruitful conversations in the future.
Thank you, Tim.
We hope so.